Welcome to Module 4, Challenges, Issues, and Ethical Dilemmas in Clinical Practice. Okay, so today we'll be talking about the Social Work Code of Ethics and other ethical codes that we are guided by in clinical practice, ethical decision-making philosophies and models, self-determination, informed consent, use of technology, and additional ethical issues. So we're going to move pretty quickly through the Code of Ethics, although that is something that is assigned to you as a reading, and it's fairly straightforward. So there are several slides in the slide deck that do not have any audio accompaniment to them, and they're pretty self-explanatory. Although, again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and we can talk about in more detail. So the NASW Code of Ethics is constantly evolving. And as we'll see later in the slide deck, there are there are three brief video clips from Frederick Reamer, which I believe I mentioned in Module 1. And he's, excuse me, a primary ethicist who is frequently called to testify on behalf of or sometimes, unfortunately, against social workers who are at risk for losing their license or other forms of malpractice. However, the NASW Code of Ethics has 6 primary areas, and usually most ethical issues can fall under one of 6 of those. Your responsibility as a clinician to clients, your responsibility to colleagues, your comportment and conduct in practice settings, your ethical obligations and responsibilities as professionals, professional social workers, even broader than that, to the social work profession, and finally, responsibilities to the broader society. So it's important to be attuned to which ethical issues are at play when you're confronted with a potential dilemma. And one way in which you can parse out what exactly is the ethical issue or sets of ethical issues that are prominent are to read through each of the 6 categories that the NASW puts together in terms of your ethical responsibilities. So it may be that you have a client that would like to access their medical records or their treatment records, and the agency may feel that they shouldn't have access to them. So that would be an example of a potential ethical dilemma being, are we promoting the well-being of clients, and how is the agency potentially infringing on the rights of that individual to receive their records. So typically there are 5 sources of ethical dilemmas. And when you are doing the assignment for Module 6 or 9, your group assignment, it's critical that you evaluate where the source is in terms of not only the players involved, but what are the source of that, what's the source of that ethical dilemma? The first is when the application or boundary of an ethical standard is unclear. So for example, excuse me, you may have a client who you've been working with for a year, and you know that it's unethical to have a personal relationship perhaps with that client. However, maybe 10 years have passed and that client would like to invite you out for coffee. What is the boundary? What is the ethical standard in that case? The second is when standards conflict with institutional demands. And the medical record example is a good one. Perhaps you have an ethical mandate to provide access to that individual's treatment notes. However, the institution may feel differently. So when there's a conflict between you as a social worker and a larger agency context, that's a good example of number two. The third is when there are conflicting loyalties. So whom is your loyalty to? Is it to the client that you're working with, maybe a family member, or is it the organization? So for example, you may have a client who has a terminal illness, just a case in point, and the daughter perhaps, and I'm just making this up, but just to give you the point, the daughter might feel that they do not want their mother to know that they have a terminal illness. So who is your loyalty to? Do you have a loyalty to your client, to the daughter, to both parties? And how do you resolve that? The fourth source is when a professional finds it difficult to adhere to an ethical standard. So there may be an ethical standard in place that you may have your own moral code or value system that is in conflict with it. And then the fifth is when good solutions seem unattainable. And I'm sure that half a dozen examples just came to your mind there about no matter what course of action you take, it's a lose-lose situation in your mind. So unfortunately, most social workers rely on their practiced wisdom and they decide ethical issues quickly without a systematic approach to making a decision, understanding the pros and cons of that decision, or using paradigms to assist. And that can be dangerous, or you could err in those cases. So what we're going to focus on are different paradigms that you can use in order to identify and potentially resolve an ethical dilemma in your practice. This is one model, and you'll notice there's substantial overlap across models. It's called the ethic model. And each letter stands for something or some action point. The E is for examining the relevant personal, societal, agency, client, and professional values. So looking at all of that in totality. The T means to stand for, or what it stands for is thinking about what ethical standard or standards of the NASW Code of Ethics apply. So looking across those 6 categories, is it in relation to the individual, the colleague? Is it as a professional social worker? Is it a larger societal issue as a whole? Okay. The H stands for hypothesizing about possible consequences of different directions. So what is it that you could do? Using a problem-solving approach. What could you do and what would happen? The I means identifying who will benefit and who will be harmed in view of the social worker's commitment to the most vulnerable individuals. So, for example, will there be any children involved? What will be their potential benefit of your particular course of action? Is there any possibility that they will be harmed in some way? What is that? And then the C means consulting with supervisors and colleagues about the most ethical choice. So relying on the collective practice wisdom of your colleagues and supervisors to come upon the best way to resolve the issue. The ABCDE multiple perspectives framework is another paradigm. This is actually found in Ruffalo's book, where A stands for assessing your options. So what are the potential courses of action you could pursue? B focuses on being mindful of the process involved in this. So what would happen if you were to give that client their treatment records? What would be the potential consequence? The C involves consultation, so with supervisors, colleagues, anyone at the agency, maybe a legal representative, someone from NASW. There are multiple people that you could consult about your potential decision. D addresses documenting the decision process, so always keeping an audit trail. about your actions or inactions. So, what you did, why, what was the result? Um, because if it ever ended up becoming a legal situation where you were called into court, having that audit trail can be very helpful for tracking your actions and your decision making. And then E involves evaluating the outcomes. What was the eventual outcome? You may not know. You may make a call to DCF on behalf of a family, and then that family drops out of treatment, and you don't know what the resolution was. Optimally, you would have some sense of resolution, but there are times in which you may not know the outcome. But whenever possible, you would evaluate the outcome as well as your process, so going through those steps. And Reamer also, Frederick Reamer, has 7 steps. Again, very similar to the other 2 models. You would identify the ethical issues, the values at play, whom is likely to be affected. You would then identify all potential courses of action and the participants involved, who might be benefited, who might have some risk or harm. You would then examine the reasons in favor of and opposed to each course of action. So you would look at various codes and principles, including the NASW Code of Ethics, as well as any legal obligations or principles, ethical theories, and guidelines. What I also like about Reamer's model is that he considers the values of the professional and how do they marry on to the ethical issue that's at play. But moving forward, the 5th step would be to consult with colleagues and appropriate experts. The 6th is to make the decision and again, document, document, document. And then the 7th and the final step is to monitor the outcome, evaluate it, and document that decision. So whatever came out of that particular action. So I'd like for you to read through this case study about Alexis, an 18-year-old student. And you'll then walk through using a paradigm to identify the ethical issue, who's potentially benefiting and might be harmed by it, what are the pros and cons of each ethical decision, and the outcome. So other ethical codes that guide our practice include self-determination, and that is that as much as we may want a particular outcome for a client or client system, we also respect and value that client has the right to decide whether they're going to, say, pursue um, whatever it is that we think is best for them. And when we don't support in that way, or we withhold information, or we limit the right of self-determination, we're compromising our own ethical code. Okay, so as I had mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, if you have a client who has a terminal illness and the daughter would like to withhold that information, is it a violation of self-determination to withhold that information from your client? So therapeutic privilege in the medical profession suggests that there's a legal exception to standard of disclosure. So a medical professional can legally withhold information if it's in the best interest of that individual. But how does that extend to social workers? And who is your client? Is the daughter your client, or is the individual the mother, or both of them? So it does call into play different ethical issues from a seemingly simple ethical dilemma. Other potential ethical issues involve informed consent and confidentiality. And this is also, this is actually quite relevant to research. But it really means that in informed consent, your client knows what intervention you're trying, the benefits and risks involved in such, the limits of services. So being very clear about, we're going to be meeting for 10 weeks, 1 hour each week. Your insurance will cover X, Y, and Z. You would also present reasonable alternatives. Again, this really taps into the relevance of the treatment or the therapeutic approach to that consumer. So there are different options out there. Here are some that have also been shown to be effective for treating anxiety. This is how much services will cost, and you absolutely have the right to refuse or withdraw consent. Okay. And you would optimally have this in a written, documented way so that you would have it on file in case you would need to revisit it for some reason. Now, I'm sure you're well versed that there are always exceptions to confidentiality. That includes if a child is at risk, so state mandated child abuse and neglect reporting laws, also elder abuse. These exemptions to confidentiality, they're usually referred to as mandated reporting. There are many, many professionals who are considered mandated reporters. And you also within it have a duty to protect the individual as well as others who might be harmed if by your client or consumer. So for example, if you have a client that says, I'm going to kill X, you have an ethical obligation to inform X that their life is potentially in jeopardy. Okay? And that is referred to as the duty to warn act. So any communication between you and your client is considered privileged, and optimally that is protected information that is is protected from being admissible in court or some legal in some legal way without their permission. However, there are exemptions to this as well. Your client may waive their right to privileged communication. Your client may share that material in court proceedings or litigation. You as a social worker may be called to testify, and in that case you are under legal obligation to disclose. If the client threatens to commit suicide or harm others, you would also violate privileged communication. If a minor is involved in criminal activity, or again, if child abuse and or neglect is suspected, also elder abuse. Okay, and then, as I had mentioned, technology and social media use is one of those emerging areas or newer areas in which the NASW Code of Ethics has had to keep pace with. And so this set of standards has arisen based on media such as Facebook and Instagram. What if a client wants to friend you? Your client hasn't shown for 2 weeks. Do you look on Facebook to see if they're active? So there are guidelines that are constantly being developed around use of social media and technology.
I'm involved in a case right now. In fact, this very morning, I spent an hour and a half on the phone with an attorney from another state who's representing actually a supervisor in a case where there were boundary violations, where the clinician in this case disclosed to the client details about his own failing marriage, his own frustration with his job in the human services, where they really connected in a meaningful way about their shared despair about their personal lives. And this is a clinician who, in my opinion, and I'll be testifying in this case, was grooming this client. And and they, by the way, ended up having a sexual relationship. In my opinion, a key piece of evidence in this case was the inappropriate, non-therapeutic self-disclosure about the clinician's personal trauma, failed relationships, use of marijuana, and he was doing this in a way to try to join with this client. In contrast, I think many clinicians very appropriately and therapeutically share information about themselves for constructive purposes for the client's benefit. An example would be a parent who is bringing in a 6-year-old child who's having major behavioral issues in the classroom, having a difficult time adjusting to school, acting out, and the parent is in despair and wants this clinician who works with children to help. And that clinician decides in the middle of a session, third, fourth session, whatever, to say to the client, you know, a number of years ago, when my middle child was about age 6, I remember, you know, he had some challenges. There were some behavioral issues. And I learned so much about how to manage behavior. And I'm going to share some of what I've learned with you.
So these are 3 brief video snippets of Reamer and some of his ethical issues that he has presented in court about. You might not be able to access these directly from the PowerPoint slide, but if you cut and paste onto a new browser, it will send you to the YouTube site where you can play these one after the other. There's usually in the right-hand side, if you play one, the other 2 are right there.
During the last 3 or 4 years, I have noticed a non-trivial jump in the cases I'm getting involved in where online technology, digital technology, social media, social networking is part of the evidence, part of the ethics challenge. I'll give you a couple of very succinct examples. I recently testified in a case where a clinician had a complaint filed against him, licensing board, by a disgruntled client. The complaint had nothing to do with digital technology, social networking, none of it. In this case, part of the evidence having to do with alleged boundary violations, I had to review a series of email messages that the clinician sent to the client. When I testified, had to note that the email messages were sent by the clinician to the client late at night from the clinician's personal email address, not an agency-based email address, time-stamped 11:27 p.m., with attachments that included poems that the clinician had written that he wanted to share with his client because the clinician thought these would be therapeutically useful. Mm-hmm. The fact that they were having email exchanges late at night using a personal email address with poetry attached, that ended up being significant in this case because it suggested boundary ambiguity.
Just to clarify, was there an issue of sexual impropriety in this case?
No, this was a disgruntled client who believed that the clinician had abandoned her, that the clinician didn't respond to messages, the clinician was distancing himself. This is a client who, and I don't want to stereotype or generalize, had some pretty severe borderline issues and became angrier and angrier with this clinician. The clinician couldn't do enough, couldn't move fast enough, didn't walk on water, and the client ultimately fired the clinician, owed the clinician a fair amount of money, decided to file a licensing board complaint. I've seen many of these. This is the first case I've been involved in where some of the evidence included the digital technology. I've had clinicians say, it's true, this is a licensing board hearing. Boundary case. Yes, I accepted the gifts. Why did you accept the gift? I didn't want to hurt the client. Was that a clinical judgment? Yes, it was. Weren't you taught to document clinical judgments? Yes. Well, show me in your record where it says. It's not there. If it's not written, it didn't happen. That's the lawyer's line. So I say, if you decide to accept the gift, if you decide to go to the graduation, if you decide to go to the wedding, and there's a clear therapeutic rationale, document, document, document. It's a lifesaver. And if I go to the wedding, since presumably it's not tomorrow, it's going to be in 8 weeks or whatever, risk management. Discuss it in peer consultation for 2 reasons. One is, get outside yourself. What do you guys think? Should I go? Shouldn't I go? It does 2 things. One is it's sort of, getting that outside perspective, which I think can be remarkably helpful, and you document that you had the peer consultation. That shows a good faith effort. I didn't make an impulsive decision to go to the wedding because I don't understand boundaries or I thought they were having a great caterer. No. This was a clinical judgment. Look at my notes. Peer consultation, clinical rationale. I think that's how you avoid problems, and you don't go to the party afterwards, no matter how good the food is.
Okay, along the lines of other ethical principles that are applied to social workers, addressing malpractice and unethical behavior. So we as professionals have a responsibility to our clients and consumers to alert state licensing boards and governing authorities when we become aware of unethical behavior. Um, Usually, or as a rule of thumb, it's always helpful to talk to your supervisor or colleagues before you um, to decide what ethical issue may be at play. Again, using one of those paradigms that we mentioned before. But there are unfortunately times in which you will have to take this course of action if you see a colleague engaging in unprofessional, potentially harmful behavior. Okay, and so this is probably one of my favorite slides to talk through. It's about the professional use of self. To be aware of how our personal experiences, our values, our beliefs may impinge upon or help the therapeutic relationship. That is critical that we do that work and that we do it ongoingly to understand our role in the therapeutic process and to also be aware of potential limitations. Are there individuals that you're just not comfortable working with, or situations or settings? So I had a student a few years ago who just didn't feel comfortable working in a Planned Parenthood setting because it clashed with her personal beliefs. Being aware of that and understanding whether that's something that potentially you could modify or that you feel is something you will not is critical in order for us to do the work that we do as social workers. Okay, so we've reached the end of Module 4. Next module, which is very exciting, we're going to start moving into the content about emerging programs and practice models. And we'll start with depression. Now, you have another online post due for this week. And that, again, can be found in your chats folder. And also, you'll be using what you have learned in this module for your lead class discussion on an issue or dilemma. So in brief, and you can look at your syllabus page 5, you would identify a dilemma or ethical issue associated with your practice. Using the Social Work Code of Ethics, you would identify the key values and ethical principles involved in this dilemma or issue. So again, is it an issue regarding an individual, a colleague, your professional conduct, your you as a professional social worker, the broader society, and so forth? You would also identify relevant local, state, or federal laws or regulation. And where this would come up most clearly is in a case of mandated reporting. There may not be any relevant local, state, or federal laws or regulations. If that's the case, you would say such, okay? Using the literature, so using those paradigms, and you don't have to use all of them. You could choose one, such as Reamer's paradigm. You would identify 3 to 4 possible pathways to respond to the dilemma, and the one that you would choose to pursue, with a justification for your choice. So that justification might include the benefit, that you feel it would benefit the most people, or the least amount of harm, or whatever it is, but coming up with a justification. And what you would do for your presentation is provide the rest of the class with a summary of your issue, the relevant knowledge needed to engage in a discussion of it. So as part of that discussion, you would present your choice and justification and respond to student questions and critiques of that choice. So you might take some time to describe the ethical issue or dilemma, any, again, local, state, federal laws, the code of ethics, so how that interplays, what code of ethics are at play here. Then you would identify 3 to 4 pathways. So what are a couple of things you could do and what might happen? And then the one that you do choose, and you would open it up for discussion to the rest of the class. If any of you have questions about that, please feel very free to reach out to me. Remember, you're going to work on this with your group. How you divide it up amongst your group members is up to you. And then there was one more thing that I just blanked on that I wanted to say about it. Well, I don't remember. If I do remember, I'll let you know. But that should be the end of Module 4. And we will move on to, again, emerging practice models and programs in depression for Module 5.